My family told everyone I failed. Then his base commander spoke. So here we go. I'm Jessica Bennett, 34 now, and if there's one thing you need to know about the house I grew up in, it's that the military wasn't just a job. It was the air we breathed, the language we spoke, and the standard everyone was measured against. My dad was an Army colonel, the kind of man who could give orders in his sleep, and probably did. My grandfather, a Navy captain, used to recite naval battle strategies like bedtime stories. And my older brother, of course, a Marine major who might as well have come out of the womb in uniform. In that world, being male came with an automatic license to serve. If you were a woman, your job was to support, bake, bandage, bear it. My mother played that role so well they could have carved her face onto the home front monument. And me? I wasn't buying it. I don't know when the obsession started, but I remember being 7, sneaking into the basement when no one was looking, thumbing through my father's old field manuals. That's where I found leadership in combat, and devoured every page like it was candy. I kept a flashlight hidden behind the dryer vent and read chapters at night, imagining myself giving the orders, not fetching the coffee for someone who did. It wasn't like I shouted it from the rooftops. I knew better. At family dinners, while my dad bragged about Michael's exemplary conduct during jungle warfare training, I was praised for how neatly I folded the napkins. I stopped offering to talk about school altogether. Even when I aced my AP history class or won a debate championship, my father would just nod vaguely and go back to recounting his officer academy stories. It was around middle school when I started saying out loud that I wanted to go to West Point. My brother laughed so hard he nearly choked on his meatloaf. Jess, they don't hand out rifles to girls who cry during horror movies. And that was it. He never let me forget that one time I got spooked during The Sixth Sense. My mother gently suggested ROTC might be more appropriate for a girl. My grandfather, who was usually silent at the dinner table unless the subject was naval command, looked up from his plate and said, "The military needs strong women at home." I remember that sentence like a gunshot. I was 12, so I stopped talking and started working. I ran drills by myself in the backyard until my shoes were wrecked and my legs ached. I started waking up at 5 a.m. to jog laps around the neighborhood, wearing an oversized hoodie and my brother's old boots. I shadowed my school's ROTC even though I wasn't allowed to join yet, and when no one was home, I practiced salutes in the hallway mirror. I was preparing, even if no one else thought I was worth preparing for. One afternoon during high school, I brought home an application packet for West Point. My dad found it in my backpack while looking for spare change. He was always digging through my stuff, and his face just froze. He held it like it was a joke, or worse, an embarrassment. "You're not cut out for that. You bruise too easy. You argue too much. You're too emotional." Then he folded the packet in half and set it on the counter without looking at me. I went to my room, closed the door, and just stared at the wall for a while. Not crying, just still. I didn't throw a fit. I didn't storm out. I quietly went online and ordered another application. I filled it out the next day in the school library. In between classes, forging my parents' signatures were needed. No one ever found out. I still don't know if I did it to prove them wrong or to prove myself right. Maybe both. More happened after that, but this is where I'll stop for now. I found out I got into West Point on a Thursday afternoon, right after track practice. I was still sweating through my t-shirt, sneakers muddy, and my hair pulled back into the tightest ponytail possible because that's how I trained. No distractions, no frills. The email came through while I was waiting outside the gym for my ride. I opened it on my cracked phone screen, barely able to read past the words "congratulations" before I felt everything inside me go quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from disbelief or confusion. It was the heavy, weighted silence of a long-awaited confirmation. I hadn't just hoped for this. I bled for it. When I got home, I didn't burst in with the news. I didn't shout or wave the letter in anyone's face. I left my gear by the door, washed my hands, and set the dinner table like I always did. I waited until we were halfway through the baked chicken and green beans before I said, calm and clear, "I got in. West Point. I'm going." For a moment, no one said a thing. My mother set down her fork like I'd told her someone died. Michael didn't even look up from his phone. And my father? He chewed slowly, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and then said, "You'll fail in a month." That was it. Not congratulations. Not even surprise. Just a sentence that landed like a door being slammed in my face. After dinner, I sat in my room for a long time. Not crying. Just sitting, holding the printed acceptance letter in my lap and wondering what it would have felt like to hear someone say they were proud of me. I guess I'll never know. Graduation came and went with the usual fanfare, but not a word was said about my plans. My classmates knew. I'd been listed in the local paper's college acceptances, but my family acted like I was heading off to some community college for general studies. My dad even told one of the neighbors I'd probably change my mind once I saw how tough it was. At the party they threw for Michael's promotion to major, no one mentioned my name. Not once. I stood there for hours, smiling at relatives who asked if I was still doing that military thing, like it was a phase or a cosplay habit I'd grow out of. The day I left, there was no big goodbye, no family breakfast, no packed car with tearful hugs and last-minute advice. My dad tossed my duffel bag in the trunk and drove me to the bus station like I was heading off to summer camp I'd begged to attend. We didn't talk on the way there. He pulled up at the curb, popped the trunk, and said, "Don't call asking for help. You wanted this." Then he drove off before I'd even closed the door. I sat on that metal bench with my orders in my lap and a pair of old running shoes tied to my backpack, pretending not to care that no one had bothered to show up. No handshake, no hug, no nothing. And in that moment, I made myself a promise. If I failed, I wouldn't come back here. Not ever. I'd rather disappear completely than crawl home to the people who were waiting to see me collapse. I told myself, right then and there, that if I had to carry this alone, I would. No matter how heavy it got. Because at least then, it would be mine. Beast Barracks nearly broke me. The first 6 weeks at West Point were a blur of sweat, shouting, and bone-deep exhaustion. I'd prepared as best I could, physically, mentally, emotionally, but nothing gets you ready for being stripped down to nothing, then expected to rebuild yourself under the weight of constant scrutiny and sandbags. I barely slept. My hands blistered from rifle drills, my legs ached from endless formations, and my brain felt like it was chewing through concrete just to keep up with the academic load. Everyone has their moment where they think about quitting. Mine came the night we ran combat drills in a downpour, and I slipped hard on a muddy slope, tearing open my palm and banging my shoulder so bad I couldn't lift it the next morning. I lay awake on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my father had been right. That was when I met Diane. She was my squad mate, shorter than me, quieter than most, but built like a steel spring. She'd been a track runner in high school, and while I dragged myself through those early morning PT sessions like a zombie, she floated. But she wasn't smug about it. She noticed the bruises I tried to hide and handed me a spare wrap for my wrist without saying a word. We weren't instant best friends, but over time, we became each other's gravity. When I couldn't find my footing, she pulled me forward. When she cracked under the pressure of one too many inspections, I stood beside her and took the heat. Captain Mitchell came later. He wasn't the loudest officer or the most intimidating, but he had this way of speaking that made you want to stand straighter, not out of fear, but out of respect. He pulled me aside after a tactical simulation exercise I'd nearly flubbed entirely. Nerves, overthinking, too many voices in my head that weren't mine. He told me, flat out, "You're not here to prove anything to your family. You're here to become who you already are. So stop apologizing for it." I don't know why that line stuck, but it did. Every time I wanted to crawl back into my shell, I'd hear his voice. That was the first time in my life someone looked at me, not as someone pretending to belong, but as someone who already did. I was finally finding my pace, getting stronger, faster, sharper. Then came the injury. Second semester, obstacle course. A mistimed jump during the final test of the week, and I went down hard. My right leg twisted beneath me with a sickening snap. I remember the pain being so sudden and sharp that I didn't even scream. Just went cold. By the time they got me to the medic tent, I already knew. Partial fracture, torn ligaments, at least a few months off my feet. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the fear. That I'd be recycled, dropped, sent home. That I'd have to limp back to Connecticut and face the smug silence of a living room full of, "I told you so." I spent 7 months in recovery. 7 long months of physical therapy, reconditioning, and endless mental battles with myself. Diane visited me every week. Captain Mitchell checked on my progress, kept me looped in on classwork, made sure I didn't drown in the quiet. I learned to walk again, then to run, and finally, to lead. I came back slower but hungrier. By my final year, I wasn't just keeping up, I was setting the bar. I graduated in the top 5% of my class. Academic excellence, leadership honors, commendation from the Corps Tactical Department. My name was announced over the speakers. My classmates cheered. Diane hugged me so tight I thought she might crack my ribs. Captain Mitchell saluted me during the commissioning ceremony. My name was etched into the Academy's honors list, recorded in history. I sent a graduation photo to my parents. My dad texted back 2 days later. "Looks like you played soldier well enough. Let us know when you're done pretending." That was all he said. No phone call, no card, no acknowledgement beyond that single condescending line. I stared at the message until my eyes burned. Then I put the phone down and went back to packing for my first assignment. There was nothing left for me in that house. But out here, finally, I had built something that was mine. No one could take that from me. Not anymore. My first assignment after West Point was a company-level role with the 82nd Airborne. I showed up with my boots still too new, saluting every officer like I had something to prove, and I did. I got the kind of looks female officers always get on day one, a mix of cautious respect, quiet doubt, and outright curiosity. But I didn't flinch. I learned every name in my platoon by the end of the first week, and by the end of the month, they followed my orders without hesitation. Not because I yelled the loudest or pushed them the hardest, but because I didn't ask them to do anything I wasn't ready to do myself. Over the next few years, I moved quickly through command roles. Some of it was timing, some of it was politics, but most of it was because I made myself impossible to ignore. I volunteered for the hard assignments, the ones that involved more than just logistics or morale speeches. I led live-fire training ops in high-risk zones. I built teams that didn't just meet objectives, they outperformed units with twice our experience. My evaluations were brutal and honest and better than I ever expected. Somewhere along the way, people stopped seeing me as a token and started seeing me as a leader. Then came the invitation to an analytical command rotation, something I hadn't planned for, but I said yes before they finished the sentence. It meant long hours, classified briefings, and situations where the stakes were written in numbers I had to pretend didn't scare the hell out of me. I worked under a colonel who'd once briefed the Joint Chiefs. He asked me during our first meeting, "Do you know what it's like to change strategy with lives on the line?" I looked him in the eye and said, "No, sir. But I'm here to learn." Eventually, I wasn't just reading reports, I was shaping them. By the time I turned 31, I was tapped for a Special Operations Strategic Unit in coordination with SOCOM. I sat in windowless rooms, reviewing data from drone footage and satellite intelligence, briefing field leaders on counterinsurgency risks. I didn't wear a patch that told the world where I was. My location rotated quarterly. Half the time I couldn't even say where I'd been, and when I could, I lied. My promotion to colonel came faster than anyone predicted. People whispered about how I must have been somebody's favorite, how I probably worked in admin, how the standards were different now. I ignored it, like I'd always done. I didn't wear my resume on my sleeve, but the people who served with me didn't need a breakdown. They saw what I brought to the table, and they kept asking for more. The General's Star came 2 years later. There was no parade, no celebration, just a quiet ceremony and a handshake that felt more like a responsibility than an honor. I was 34, one of the youngest women ever promoted to that rank in my division. But when I called my parents, just to let them know, not expecting anything, I got silence for a second. Then my mother said, "Well, you always were good with paperwork." That was it. Not congratulations. Not, "We're proud of you." Just more of the same dismissal they'd handed me since I was old enough to walk. My father chimed in a minute later, asked if I still had a real chain of command, or if I was just part of some committee. I could hear Michael in the background, probably sipping a beer, laughing like it was some big inside joke. The woman who'd survived training that left men broken. The officer who'd briefed active combat deployments and sat behind locked doors making calls no one ever wanted to make. But to them, I was just the girl who used to cry during thunderstorms and now probably spent her day typing memos. I didn't bother explaining. There was no point. I just hung up, walked to my next meeting, and never mentioned it again. I stopped telling them anything after the promotion. Not out of bitterness, or even pain. It was just easier. The less I said, the fewer opportunities they had to twist it into something small. I learned a long time ago that some people aren't interested in truth. They want a story that makes them feel safe, superior, settled. And in my family, the story of Jessica, the failed daughter, the soft one, the one who cried during war movies and had emotional issues, was too convenient to let go. So I gave it to them. I smiled through every holiday call, answered vaguely when they asked if I was still at that desk job, and never corrected my brother when he joked about how I used to hide behind the couch during Saving Private Ryan. He'd tell that story every Thanksgiving like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Remember that time Jess actually started crying during the beach scene? I thought we were going to have to take her to a therapist. Then he'd elbow my dad, who'd just nod and say, "Some people aren't built for the real stuff." And I'd sit there quietly, eating mashed potatoes, nodding along like I wasn't briefing real combat units 4 days a week. My mother, for her part, always played the part of concerned matriarch with a worried smile. "She's always been sensitive," she'd say to neighbors or relatives. "We don't know much about what she actually does, but I think she has some kind of administrative role now. That's probably best for her temperament." If anyone asked me directly, she'd jump in before I could speak. Jessica has always needed a little more peace in her life. The military probably helps her stay structured. What she really meant was, "We prefer the version of you that doesn't ask for recognition." Stephanie, my younger sister, became the family's golden light after Michael. She got into law school, posted carefully curated engagement photos, hosted brunches that my mother uploaded to Facebook with captions like, "So proud of our brilliant girl." My father couldn't stop talking about how Stephanie handled pressure like a professional, how she'd be a judge one day, how she understood discipline. They made it sound like she was born for greatness, and I was just adjacent to it. At some point, I realized they didn't even need me to fail. They just needed me not to succeed in a way that disrupted their comfort. And success in silence, to them, looked enough like failure that they didn't have to adjust their narrative. So I stopped sending updates. No photos from the base. No calls about deployments. No invitations to promotions or speaking events. I let them live in the version of me they preferred. Harmless, unremarkable, distant. I played my part when I had to, never challenged their assumptions, never corrected them in public. I figured if the truth didn't matter to them, it didn't need to be offered. It wasn't about shame. It was survival. Because after all this time, I understood something very clearly. Their version of me wasn't rooted in misunderstanding. It was built on purpose. And if I tried to dismantle it, they wouldn't listen. They'd just dig in deeper. So I let them have it. I wore a dark blue blouse and black slacks to Stephanie's promotion ceremony. Nothing that stood out. My hair was pinned up neatly, no makeup, no insignia. I parked in the visitor lot, walked in like anyone else, sat in the second row with the family because they expected me to, not because I wanted to be there. My father had already launched into a speech about how Stephanie was the only one of his daughters who really understood leadership, and my mother was nodding proudly like someone had just handed her a trophy. I hadn't said a word since we arrived. The room was typical, rows of folding chairs, a flag against the back wall, a modest lectern flanked by service personnel in dress uniforms. Stephanie stood tall near the front, beaming in her new rank. I watched without emotion, clapping when expected. My father had just finished telling a retired officer seated nearby that military excellence runs in the family. Well, mostly, when I felt a shift behind me. Footsteps. Confident. Measured. "Excuse me," someone said from the aisle. "Are you General Bennett?" I turned my head slowly. "Colonel Harrison, base commander." Bronze clusters lined his chest, his cap tucked neatly under his arm. I hadn't seen him since a briefing 2 years ago on Fort Riley, where we debated tactical restructuring across infantry rotation zones. I hadn't expected him here. He looked straight at me, unblinking. "It is you," he said. "We're still using your integrated supply protocols. Multiple bases have adopted them now. Streamlined operations across 3 divisions." The room froze. Chairs creaked as people turned. I could feel my father staring at me, but I didn't look back. My mother's hand went to her necklace like it might anchor her. Stephanie blinked, unsure of what she was seeing. Even the officer reading names at the front stopped mid-sentence. I stood slowly and offered my hand. "Colonel Harrison," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's good to see you again." He gripped it firmly. "You never mentioned you were related to Lieutenant Bennett," he said, glancing toward my sister. Small world. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came out. For the first time I could remember, he didn't have anything to say. Colonel Harrison looked back at me. "We should talk soon. I've got some teams trying to implement your tactical coordination framework, but they're hitting friction. You always had a way of cutting through that." I nodded once. "Send the files. I'll take a look." He gave a tight smile, then turned and walked away without another word. I sat down again without adjusting my expression. My hands were folded in my lap, steady as ever. The room slowly returned to motion. Stephanie's name was called. Applause resumed, but it was thinner now, scattered. My father didn't resume his monologue. My mother didn't resume her nodding. No one looked at me directly, but they didn't stop glancing either. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't know them explanations. Not anymore. We didn't make it out of the parking lot before my mother insisted we just talk for a minute. She said it with the same brittle smile she used when guests overstayed their welcome. So we ended up in the corner of the base lounge, just the 5 of us crammed around a small table meant for coffee and pleasantries, not the dismantling of decades of silence. My father sat stiffly across from me, arms folded, a look on his face like someone had rewired the world without his permission. My mother perched next to him, still clutching her purse in her lap like it was a shield. Michael leaned back in his chair, arms spread, doing that smug smirk he always defaulted to when he felt challenged. Stephanie stood, arms crossed, not smirking, not smiling, just quiet. "So," my father started, his voice tight. "General?" I didn't answer right away. I let the weight of it hang in the air for a moment. Then I said, "Yes." He blinked slowly. "You've been a general and never told us?" My mother's voice was a whisper, but it cut sharply. "Why would you hide something like that from your family?" I looked at her, then him, then Michael, then finally at Stephanie. Because every time I achieved something, it got turned into something small. Every step I took was met with sarcasm or silence. And eventually, I got tired of handing over parts of myself for people to mock. Michael scoffed, leaned forward. Oh, come on. No one mocked you. You're being dramatic again. Really? I said, keeping my voice level. You've spent the last 20 years telling the same joke about me crying during a movie. Dad called my West Point admission a phase. Mom told people I was probably doing admin work. And every time I said anything that didn't fit your version of who I'm supposed to be, you either laughed it off or ignored it. Silence. No one moved. Stephanie spoke next, slowly. We all supported a false narrative, she said, her voice heavier than I'd ever heard it. We liked the version of you that made us feel better about ourselves. My father looked at her like she'd just switched teams mid-game. What are you talking about, Steph? She didn't flinch. You were proud of me for making captain, and I was proud too, but Jess outranked me by 10 miles and no one even asked what she did. Because we all thought we already knew. My mother shook her head, her eyes glossy. That's not fair. No, I said. It is fair. You built a story around who you thought I was. And any time I deviated from it, you pulled me back with silence or dismissal. You don't get to be shocked now. And that's when Ryan stepped in. He'd been sitting quietly beside me the whole time, hands clasped, jaw set. But now he stood, 6'2", steady as a mountain when he's angry. Enough, he said. Jess didn't hide anything. She protected herself. She did more than any of you ever imagined, and not once did she ask for applause. She's led teams, rebuilt logistics systems from scratch, saved lives in ways you'll never understand. And you treated it like she worked at a DMV. No one interrupted him. He looked at my father. You talk about honor like it's something you hand down, but you never gave her a damn thing. She earned every star on her own, and you still looked right through her. My father didn't speak. My mother turned her face away. Michael tapped his fingers against the table, but said nothing else. Stephanie met my eyes. I'm sorry, she said. It was quiet. Honest. No defense. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I just felt done. A week later, I got a message from my father. Just a sentence. Come to dinner. Please. We met at a quiet place downtown, the kind with linen napkins and low lighting, where people speak softly and cut their food with care. I wasn't sure what to expect. Ryan came with me, and I could feel his hand brush mine under the table as we sat down. My father was the first to speak. His voice was steady, but not stiff the way it usually was when he was about to launch into a lecture. This time it came out low, slow, like the words had to move through something heavy. I owe you an apology, he said. For a lot of things. Mostly for being blind to who you really are. I thought I was teaching you strength by being hard on you. But the truth is, I didn't see you. Not the way I should have. My mother reached across the table, her eyes already red. What have we done, Jessica? She asked, not like someone demanding an answer, but like someone finally realizing the damage they'd caused. We made you smaller so we could feel bigger. We called it love, but it wasn't. Not really. Michael looked like he'd aged 10 years since the ceremony. For once, he didn't crack a joke or lean back like none of it mattered. He just said, you were right. And I was a jerk. I believed what was easiest to believe. Stephanie nodded beside him. We all did. I didn't say much. I let their words sit there, let them settle into the space where blame used to live. I didn't know what came next, and I didn't need to. I just knew something had shifted. 3 months later, I stood on a stage in Washington, the spotlight hitting my face as I accepted a public award for strategic leadership. I gave a short speech, nothing dramatic. Just facts, gratitude, acknowledgments. I could see Ryan in the front row, smiling like he always did when he saw me in my element. But then I saw them too. My father, sitting upright in a charcoal suit, eyes fixed on me like he was seeing me for the first time. My mother, hands folded, tears slipping down her cheeks, but not out of shame. Michael clapping, Stephanie beaming, their pride not wrapped in competition or guilt this time. Just pride. The applause rose around me, warm and full. But it wasn't the crowd I was thinking about. It was that girl in the basement, flashlight in hand, reading field manuals in secret because no one believed she could belong. It was the cadet limping through recovery with a brace on her leg and a fire in her chest. It was the officer who chose silence not out of weakness, but out of knowing her worth didn't require validation. And now, even surrounded by people finally ready to see me, I still stood alone in that moment. Not because I was isolated, but because I had learned the most important lesson of all. That I could believe in myself, even when no one else did.